Barbara Kingsolver's book, Demon Copperhead, won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature this year. And it's really inspired by Charles Dickens' story, David Copperfield. So it's an extraordinary book where she describes rural poverty, the effects of the opioid crisis, and she includes a scene that is so upsetting that both my wife and I, independently reading it, we had to shut the book and close it and look away. The main character and the narrator is named Demon, and it's about his life and the aftermath of the collapse of the coal industry in his Virginia town. Demon longs to go and see the ocean, but wonders if he'll ever get there. His father died before he was born, and on his 11th birthday, his mother dies of an overdose. And it's just a tragic, went from one tragedy to another. Demon goes and he lives and works with foster children on a tobacco farm where all the money that he earns is taken from him. And for a brief while, he's the foster child of the McCobb family. They have 4 small children, and they too take most of the earnings that he gets from sorting garbage at a local convenience store. So when the family's car gets repossessed, they have to leave town, and there's not enough room for him to go with them. So he's left alone, and he goes off with his entire life savings in a peanut butter jar in his backpack, and he goes on the road as a 12-year-old, hitching rides, trying to find a grandmother he's never met before. Now, this is the scene that's so hard. At a truck stop, he stops, and a prostitute just keeps approaching him and hassling him. And to avoid her, he goes and hides in the men's room. So he sits in the men's room stall, and he takes out his little jar of money and puts it on the ground. But he doesn't realize that the prostitute has followed him in, and she sees that he has this jar of coins and money, $100 in that jar. And she sees that he has it. So when he comes out of the bathroom, she tells the shopkeeper that he had stolen it from her. And the shopkeeper then takes out his backpack, goes through, and takes the jar, and every last cent he owns is taken from him. He runs out into the night, and I just had to close the book. I couldn't read it for another 2 weeks after that. Intense misery, injustice, and cruelty, they make us want to look away. Think of the way that we sometimes respond when you see somebody who's living on the streets of San Francisco and they're covered with sores. Or the way that you might feel when you think of those people whose families were murdered and kidnapped by Hamas. Or you think of what the landscape looks like in Gaza these days, that terrible, terrible suffering. Now, this kind of pain, it becomes a kind of threat to our innermost self. And because we also know, we realize how vulnerable we are. And when we become parents, that level of vulnerability just goes off the charts. We're way more vulnerable than we'd ever been in our lives. When we see too much suffering, we cannot look anymore. Now, Jesus never reaches that point. Jesus sees people as they are, and he loves them. And Jesus is not afraid of his own vulnerability. Jesus does not look away. That was true as he went from town to town with his friends in Galilee, and it is true today also. It is the most important thing for us to understand Jesus' teaching. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, one of the things that Matthew does is he compares Jesus and kind of describes him as the new Moses, a new prophet. And I'm going to just give you 3 quick examples of that. So, in the very beginning of the story of Jesus' birth, King Herod kills all the infants, and so Jesus has to flee into Egypt. That's very much like in the Old Testament when the Pharaoh is trying to kill all the young Hebrew male children. So that's one example. In the book of Exodus, Jesus, there's 5 books in the Torah, and Jesus in the book of Matthew gives 5 different important discourses. And then also, if you think about the Sermon on the Mount, it's really a replay of Moses going to Mount Sinai and receiving the 10 Commandments. So what we have today is Jesus' most important sermon. And the people who've come to see him earlier before this section that we just read, they include people who are sick, afflicted with various diseases and pains, people possessed by demons or having epilepsy or stricken with paralysis. And it's also presumably includes the people who are helping those people, right? So Jesus says, when he says, these are the people he's addressing, people who are suffering, people like demon Copperhead. And Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who thirst and hunger for righteousness. And we call these the Beatitudes, and it's really easy to misunderstand them. The Greek word Jesus repeats, the word for blessed, is the Greek word makarios, and the dictionary definition of it is this, quote unquote, pertaining to being happy with the implication of enjoying favorable circumstances. So on social media, when we see the hashtag blessed, we expect pretty much the same thing that the ancient Greeks did when they saw the word makarios. Blessed people are happy, rich, healthy, attractive, strong, popular, often ruthless, sometimes deceptive or aggressive. And in the face of this common sense of what blessedness means, Jesus says something entirely different. Jesus says, blessed are the poor, those who are mourning, the gentle, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted, and the reviled. Now, Jesus is not telling us to go out and try to become poor in spirit or to make ourselves sad so that we're mourning. Jesus challenges our idea of what it means to be blessed. And I want to this is the one part of the sermon I should have left out, but I'm going to include it anyway, because it involves a very complicated grammatical point. In grammar, there are these things called moods. So moods are a grammatical form that describes the speaker's view of an event's reality. So sometimes when a speaker is speaking, it's about something that's certain. Sometimes it's something that's wished for. Something that's possible. Sometimes it's something that the person is demanding happen. So mood in Greek determines which of those things is going on. So I'm going to give you an example. I didn't check with her ahead of time, but my friend Caroline's in the front row, and I'm going to give you an example of the indicative. The indicative is describing how things are, and you can describe how things are in a statement or in a question. So my statement for the indicative example is Caroline sings in the choir. That's an indicative statement. And I could also say, is she the newest member? In Greek, both of those would be indicative. Now, the imperative demands something. It's like the way we use the word imperative. So it's for instance, if I said to Caroline, sing us a hymn, that would be the imperative. So Jesus, when he's talking, is not using the imperative. He's not telling you to go out and be poor in spirit. He's not telling you to go out and mourn. He's telling you the way you are. He's talking about the way people are who are experiencing his talk. And when Jesus says this, he reminds us that in the world of God, in the world of Jesus, God's blessing always comes first. We don't act a certain way and then get rewarded by God's love. God loves us first, and this love gives us strength to not ignore our own vulnerability. Jesus does not turn away from the person who is addicted or shattered by suffering or afflicted by nightmarish circumstances. Jesus looks into that person's heart, and Jesus says, "You are blessed." Now, on Thursday night, we had the bishop candidates here, and I was in the front row taking notes, and John Horton even noticed that I was taking notes, and I'm glad that I did, because one of the candidates for bishop, Augusta, mentioned an article by J.R.R. Tolkien, a paper that he wrote called On Fairy Stories. J.R.R. Tolkien is the person who wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and it's fascinating to hear about what he has to say about the subject of fantasy writing. So before J.R.R. Tolkien came on the scene, seen before that generation of writers. We did have science fiction like Jules Verne, where you'd inhabit this reality, but something would be slightly different. Like the time machine meant it was this reality, but there's also a time machine. In J.R.R. Tolkien's work and in fantasy work, they create a whole new world that has its own rules that are different from this realities. So it was fascinating to hear somebody who kind of invented that genre talking about it. So one of the distinguishing features of these stories is what Tolkien calls eucatastrophe. Now, the word catastrophe, we know what it means. It's when everything suddenly goes wrong. In Greek, the word eu means good. So a eucatastrophe is when everything suddenly goes right. It's when there seems like there's going to be no way out. It seems like there's no reason for hope. And then suddenly something completely good happens and transforms everything. It's like when Prince Charming gives the kiss. It's like when the Death Star in Star Wars is destroyed. It's like when Harry Potter comes back from the dead to fight his nemesis, Voldemort. Now, for Tolkien, we don't know whether the whole purpose of this world is good or not. We don't know because we sometimes feel like we're facing universal defeat. And he said that these stories, they give us, quote, a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. They give us a taste of joy that presents us with, quote, a sudden glimpse of underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation, but a satisfaction of the question of whether or not life has meaning. So Tolkien goes on to say that the Gospels, that is the stories of Jesus, they are about a kind of eucatastrophe in history. The story of Jesus changes everything. All human life is different because Jesus lived. And Jesus' story begins and ends in joy. So it begins with joy when Mary finds out she's pregnant with a baby who's going to change the world. And it ends in joy when Jesus is reunited with the friends who loved him so much in the resurrection. It is the story of someone who is not afraid of vulnerability, who can see every kind of human suffering and not turn away. That is Christian joy, the Gloria, the good news. Now, in Kingsolver's novel, Demon Copperhead is dying to be adopted into a family like yours. And today, we are going to adopt 6 new families. 6 new people are going to be adopted into the family of God through baptism, into the new life of grace. The courage and openness of Jesus will help them to love others in the power of the Spirit and to grow into the fullness of God's peace and glory. This experience of Jesus, of the one who does not look away, will lead them to have inquiring and discerning hearts, the courage to will and persevere, and the gift of joy and wonder in all God's works. In this hard world, they will be baptized into joy. Now, some people believe that we are accidents, mere biological machines, determined in all our decisions by the hard realities of evolution. But Jesus gives us another way. He shows us how to experience our life as a gift from God, a God who loves us even when our suffering makes us unrecognizable to anyone else. I just have one last thing because I wanted to give you a sense for what this joy feels like. But I never do this. Last week, I went surfing on the Sabbath. So exactly a week ago, I went out surfing at Ocean Beach on the most perfect day. And you could see the coastline stretching all the way from Point Reyes on the north, all the way to Pedro Point in the south, and the land looked so perfectly peaceful. It was just in the minutes before sunset, so the horsetail clouds looked so perfect, and the weather was warm, and everyone was there, and the waves were perfectly hollow, and it was the most extraordinary sense of joy. That is what I mean by the gift of joy and wonder that we experience when we experience our life as a gift from God. Do not look away. The eucatastrophe is happening. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are you, beloved and adopted by God, baptized into joy.